can help me while I start.
Oh, there we go.
Yep, one back, keep going, next. Yeah, well, no, keep going, keep going, keep going. There's a good one. That's what decommissioning looks like. Think about it. That's right, you want this. Okay, so
You gotta come on.
I gotta come this way, because I don't know how Kevin did it.
You didn't have pictures?
Very brave, is that it? Okay, so I want to start. This is always very painful, the issues of waste. So I want to start with the idea that the colossal failure of nuclear power is exposed in decommissioning and cleanup. Because the reality is that there's no scientifically sound or environmentally just solution to either the high-level waste or the low-level waste. Neither exist. And so what you're forced to do, living in a reactor community, in a sense, is have to deal with the choice that there is no good solution to the problem of nuclear waste. There are terrible solutions and really bad. And you're always trying to choose the best of the worst. And that is an unconscionable position to be put in. And part of that position is that the industry works very hard to basically pit reactor and waste communities against each other over who will get fucked last. And the reality is that reactor communities don't want the waste on site. The commitment when they were built was that this waste would be moved. Would be moved, in fact, even before the reactor shuttered, because it was supposed to be reprocessed, a great environmental program that, in fact, has led to Superfund sites in America with no solution, so that the waste, high-level waste, has piled up at reactor sites with no place to go. So I want to talk about waste, and then I want to talk about decommissioning. So I'm going to start with the waste, and then I'll get to Entergy's marvelous idea of cleanup, which is to bring in a second-rate corporation to do a really dirty, bad job and get out from under any responsibility. And this is the wave of the future in cleanup of reactors. But I want to talk just a little. Ken had 3 Caravan of Conscience tours down to Barnwell, South Carolina. When we first wanted to close Row, we had signs up, shut it and get the waste out now. Get all of it out. We don't want it around. It's important to understand that my community suffered from an epidemic of disease. We had a 10-fold increase in children with Down syndrome, statistical significance in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, breast cancer, brain tumors, mental retardation, children with learning disabilities, disabled children. We were a sacrifice community. And what is important to understand is this is true in every reactor community that exists. It's not a fluke that it was us. So we had every reason to want that waste out. Every night we'd come home and sit at our tables with people missing from our dinner because we pay our electric bills at our medical centers. That's where we've paid our bills. So we wanted it out. And one of the things that happened as they were starting to clean the site up and they began a rapid dismantlement of Row is that they began dumping radioactive waste into the river. A river our kids swim in, farmland is adjacent to, schools are adjacent to, and we actually alerted the public on July 4th, and all hell broke loose in the community because a lot of tourists come for white water. And they were calling health departments, flipped out that there was radioactive waste in the river. But we suffer from this waste. And so we went down to Barnwell, South Carolina to see what it was like to alert people along the waste process, the trains, because we felt if it hurt us, there was the potential that it could hurt other communities. When I went down to Barnwell, I left my kids. We had a whole caravan. We called it the Caravan of Conscience tour. I left my kids in Columbia because I was told it was too dangerous for them to actually go down to the dump community. We were followed by cars that didn't have license plates and were blacked out, helicopter. And when we got actually to the cemetery, because one of our organizers' family had donated the land that the Barnwell dump is on to the town for a park, but they made it into a waste dump. The Department of Defense was there with semi-automatic weapons to welcome us into the cemetery. This is how people live in these communities. It is really important to understand. Now, I've been threatened in my community, but I had never been threatened in that way, and it is really important to understand. Now, Barnwell was 48% African American, poor, rural. It in some ways looked like Haiti when I went there. And in fact, it was tragic what was going on. And terrifying. And of course, there's a leak in Barnwell. As all dumps leak, there's a 100-acre plume of tritium. You all know tritium around here. 100-acre plume of tritium going down to the single source aquifer. The only argument is the EPA says it'll take 60 years, and the people who own the dump now say it'll take 100. Why do they say it'll take 100? Because then they're not responsible. But this is the way this community lives, and it is important to understand that this is what happens in dump communities, and it happens to some extent in reactor communities. But reactor communities have been civilized over time to some extent. So the kind of terrorization that goes on is limited, where in dump communities it's in the open because they're poor, rural, minority, and Native American communities, and it's unconscionable. And yet here we are stuck in this terrible problem in which I live between two nuclear waste dumps. One 4.5 miles, 40 million curies of high-level waste. Another 16 miles, which will have way more than that. Rowe has 16 canisters, Vermont Yankee will have 60. But that's only half the problem. And I think what Kevin raised in terms of hardened on-site storage and the issues, we can talk about it when we open it up. Deep geological burial, which CAN believes in, is essential, not Yucca Mountain, but we do believe this waste, which is so dangerous and basically dangerous because of terrorism, dangerous because people want to use it, needs to be buried in a way where no one can ever get at it again. And that's very hard because it means that a community will in fact be sacrificed. But it has to be done in a way where that community has a choice to leave, where they have a choice to be protected, where they get health insurance, where all sorts of things happen. And where it's acknowledged they're a sacrifice zone instead of some dog and pony show about what a great idea to get a little money from the federal government. But the problem, so there are problems in the high-level waste, and that our decision to come up with Haas, to work on it at that conference, was in fact to provide some safety to reactor communities to accept holding the waste on site until there really was a scientifically sound and environmentally just solution because of the issues of terrorism, because of the vulnerability, that this was a way of trying to protect also targeted communities and having targeted communities understand how difficult it was for reactor communities to accept this. Because many targeted communities don't understand how reactor communities have suffered, why they want the waste, how painful it is for them. But what this raises with it in terms of hardened on-site storage is the issue of cleanup at shuttered reactors. And as I said, the colossal failure of nuclear power is exposed in cleanup. Because what happens in cleanup is the job in cleanup for nuclear corporations until recently was basically to see how dirty cleanup could be and what they could get away with, and how they could deal as utilities with a rate base that they could go back to again and again. So an example is Yankee Row cost $39 million to build in 1961, and it cost over $700 million to clean up. That doesn't include the high-level waste. Putting it in dry cast storage, that's just cleanup. And Roe is seen as one of the best reactors in the country. And that's how contaminated it was. And all these sites are contaminated like Roe. There isn't a clean nuclear site. But in fact, Roe shipped 140,000 curies of low-level waste. Doesn't mean it won't hurt you. To Barnwell, South Carolina. In South Carolina, they had an editorial showing Yankee Row as a carpetbag, using South Carolina as a toilet for its garbage. That's how we are seen. That's how New England is seen at this point. It's important to take that in. And there's a truth to it. And this is what makes this whole situation so excruciating and unconscionable. So with utilities, there was always a money stream, which made Roe still not clean. None of these sites have been released for unrestricted use. They're still dirty 25 years later. None of them are open to the public or to any other use. But what you come along with the development of merchant plants, and people here I assume know about merchant plants to some extent, which was the great idea by the industry that we don't need to be utilities anymore. We're going to make a fortune and a pot of gold, and what we want is to work on the open market, and we're going to create the next renaissance. And of course, that's been a failure. And you had Entergy coming and using money it subsidized from its rate base in the South to buy New England reactors for 20 cents on a dollar or something. Some ludicrous amount, believing their ship had come in. And all those ships have sailed. All of them. They're really unloading the whole market. And what Entergy is now doing and looking at in Vermont is what is going to set precedent for the nuclear industry, which is they have, like every nuclear corporation in the country, an underfunded decommissioning fund, substantially underfunded, because the NRC does not make nuclear corporations actually be accountable for the waste and the money that's needed to clean the site. So you have, at this point, a $500 million kitty, and you have, by Entergy's estimate, a $1.2 billion cleanup. So what does Entergy want to do? Does anyone want to tell me what they want to do? They want to get the fuck out, right? They're not crazy. They're really smart. They're smarter than us. Get out. I'm not getting out. So what do? They come up with a grand scheme. It's called North Star. Stylish name. 2-year-old company. Never decommissioned a large reactor. Ever. Ever. Did 6 megawatts. Research reactors. They say they can do it. They know exactly, job by job by job by job. And who are they going to hire? Any guess? Waste control specialists, a company going down the tubes and going to go bankrupt soon if the Department of Justice wins the lawsuit against them and stops them from merging with Energy Solutions of Utah. That's one of their great partners. 2, Areva, also close to bankruptcy, and in fact under investigation for forgery and substandard parts that it's littered in American reactors throughout the country. The third is a company, I can't remember the name, McDonald's something, but they're in the mold business. Really helpful in terms of nuclear waste, right? Mold. Mold. Right? This is a joke, isn't it? This is just a big joke. This is really an April Fool's, right? It couldn't really be real, but it is. And it's seductive. And it's somewhat seductive to the state of Vermont, although we're working to inoculate them somewhat, because they're really saying, we're going to do it for $500 million, and if it costs more than that, we're going to eat it. Of course, they only have $650 million in their own kitty, which doesn't even get to $1.2 billion. Right? So, with the 2-year track record. So they've applied to the NRC, and Entergy will sell them this great monstrosity for $1,000. This was a $400 million reactor that's now on the chopping block for $1,000. This is insane. I mean, this is really the state of insanity. And what's driving it is the fact that there is not enough money to clean the site. And so what you're going to get, if Vermont accepts this, is a precedent to basically do a really dirty and cheap cleanup. A really dirty, cheap cleanup. And part of North Star's assets is a lawsuit they haven't filed yet with the Department of Energy to sue the department to provide money for the babysitting of the high-level waste, which was tried at Surrey and turned down in around 2000. This is all a kind of show. But what it points to in this is how fucked we are, right? That's what we are. And when you're fucked, what do you want to do? Somebody knows the answer to this one. You want someone else to get fucked instead of you. Right? That's the story. Pass it on. It's a hot potato. I don't want to be the one without the chair. I'm going to let someone else get screwed. Now, I know how seductive that is to everyone here, to me as well. I've got a very bad character, in fact. So I'm very seduced. I wish they'd give me a lot of money. Maybe I let them do whatever they want. But I can't. It's my fate to be unbribable. So I really believe it was part of our going to Barnwell. It was holding that conference that reactor and waste communities have to work together, that instead of being pitted against each other over who's going to get fucked last, that in fact they work together to pressure the NRC and the government to actually create a scientifically sound and environmentally just solution, which means not accepting centralized interim storage, as seductive as it seems, not accepting Yucca Mountain, which is a colossal failure and boondoggle, but actually creating the science that's needed to make an effective repository for the high-level waste and design low-level waste dumps that actually can protect and save reactor communities, but will not, in fact, destroy target communities. Thank you.
So I asked Kevin Rose to come up, join Deb, and to open it up for questions. We have about 40 minutes. Question? Here we go.
I'll just talk about getting Yucca Mountain up and running. From the things that I remember reading about Yucca Mountain, that it's not a political Harry Reid, you know, the state of Utah. It's about it. it's not geologically sound to hold the waste, it's gonna leak.
Yeah,
So why isn't that
yeah.
the first thing that people say about it?
Yeah, I beat around the bush on the origins of the site so much. It's, according to Dr. Arjun Makajani of Institute for Energy and Environmental Research, it's the worst site ever studied for this purpose.
How much money did we
of
waste
high-level
on that?
radioactive waste disposal.
Billions?
Around 15 billion. They've adjusted for inflation to make it sound worse than it was at the time that the money was spent. I mean, remember that they've been engaged in this since the early 1980s. And Dr. Makajani found the Department of Energy documentation from the early 1980s that said that Yucca is bottom of the barrel bad compared to all these other sites we're looking at, like New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, Minnesota, many others. And what those specifically are include earthquake activity. They've had, Rose rattled off some earthquakes in her neck of the woods. Yucca had a 5.4 in June of 1992, epicentered 10 miles from the proposed tunnel, the entryway, and it did $1 million damage to the Department of Energy field office out there. And of course, their response is, we're so glad this happened, now we know what to prepare for. That's their response.
It blew out the windows.
And they did $1 million
Blew out
damage.
the windows.
There's also volcanic activity out there, so there's actually the risk of a volcano erupting through the waste and then depositing it downwind. Maybe the most significant risk, because of its high likelihood, its guaranteed likelihood, is the underground water, the hydrology of the site. And again, Dr. Makajani, who's been on Yucca for decades, he calls it the double standard standard. The double standard standards of Yucca Mountain. When Yucca Mountain can't meet the standards, either weaken the standards or get rid of them entirely. With the hydrology, they got rid of the standard entirely a month before George W. Bush's administration declared the site suitable, recommended it go forward. And that standard was on the books from the early to mid-1980s. It's called the Site Suitability Guidelines. If rainwater falls on a site, passes through the site and back out into the environment in less than 1,000 years, that site is not suitable for this purpose. And they knew by the mid-1980s that Yucca Mountain violated that standard. And instead of getting rid of it, they waited a couple decades, and right before they said, yes, let's go for it, they got rid of those site suitability guidelines. Changing the rules in the middle of the game. So it's a bad site
Is there
geologically.
any hope in this new administration that the science of it will be,
The hope
Are you
is,
kidding? With Barnum and Bailey running the White House?
Well, the state of Nevada, I mentioned the Western Shoshone treaty rights to that site.
Yeah.
They have the land title and the water title under the Treaty of Ruby Valley
Yes.
of 1863. This proposed dump is a non-starter.
Right.
If treaties are the supreme law of our land, equal in stature to the Constitution, this should be a non-starter, except the federal government's kind of ignored that, right? But the state of Nevada has 220 high merit contentions, technical scientific contentions that have gained entry into the Yucca licensing proceeding, the largest licensing proceeding in Nuclear Regulatory Commission history. And they're going to fight those tooth and nail all the way. And they have 30 to 50 more contentions that have built up based on new information since this licensing proceeding was canceled back in 2010 under the Obama administration.
well, not to take more time, but most things boil down to economics. All of that stuff must take time and money, all those cases, okay?
Yeah. $2 billion.
Yeah.
That's what's going to cost to try that case.
Why not put that money into investing into smart stuff, like what you were talking about, Deb?
I understand, but the government doesn't
Stupid.
act in this smart
Yeah.
because they don't want to actually acknowledge the problem. See, the reason they want to get the waste off site is they can't even conceive of the nuclear renaissance, of doing this all over again, unless they create the illusion of a solution that they've done something with the waste. Until that happens, then everyone just says, well, you don't have any solution to this waste. That's why central interim storage is on the table at this point.
You got a question there? Yeah.
Yep. Deb, you and Kevin both mentioned the Foss proposal.
Yes.
Was that 02 or 12?
Oh, two.
So
We, at the conference, Arjun was there. and we had reactor and waste communities there, and we were really trying to come to an agreement to help reactor sites accept holding the waste on site. And what came up was this concept of hardened on-site storage.
No, but I'm familiar, and I agree it would be a considerable step forward from the ISTE designs that are sitting not too far
Right.
away. I guess I have a couple of questions that rise out of that. First, that was 15 years ago. And frankly, I see a zero chance that HOS will ever be installed at any of the existing ISTEs. And the reason is frankly money. The licensees are never going to pay it. Government is never going to pay it. And frankly, unless the NRC changes its spots, it's never going to require it. Am I missing anything?
Well, I think we've actually been working on this a little. We have started, we held a summit in December, and from that 3 groups came, working groups came out. One is on Yucca Mountain, one is on centralized storage, the other's on HOS. And what we are looking at actually is targeting states that have not been deregulated.
What are the realistic chances of the existing ISTEs going to HOS within the next 50 years?
In deregulated environment.
In a
Indeed,
deregulated
no,
environment.
well, that's
It's
why
zero,
what
isn't it?
we're, Vermont is a state that's still regulated.
We're not.
I understand. Massachusetts is screwed. I want to acknowledge to you, you gave up your rights
They
to
never stopped.
dealing with this. It's terrible, but you did. But Vermont is not, and we are hoping, if nothing, we can get the fuel burned in so that there is adapting at each site. Is this going to be easy? It is not going to be easy. There are a lot of groups working. In fact, NRDC and others are working in terms of dealing with decommissioning rules as well at this point, working on the issue of trying to make this happen. In certain ways, if the corporation is tied to a rate base, there is the potential.
But that's not us again.
No, it's not.
So let's look here. We're sitting here in Plymouth, X miles from, and I think that's frankly what most people here are really most concerned about. I think what I'm hearing is that the practicality is that unless there is interim storage, all of Pilgrim's waste is going to continue to sit in that ISVE with more added, everything else that's there until we're roughly 70 or 80 casks, at least, as you're recommending it, at least until there is a deep repository, and God knows how long that's going to be, that is ready and willing to take it, and that's not going to happen on the day that the repository opens. So as a practical matter, without interim storage, is there any reason that Plymouth and the additional areas shouldn't assume that even though they never agreed to this, they agreed to that plant on the idea that it was all going off-site within a couple of years out of the reactor, isn't going to be stuck with that stuff for 100 years?
Yes. I'm stuck with it.
No,
Yes,
is there
I
any-
know.
But is there any reason?
I don't live in Vermont. I'm always suffering
No,
from
but-
radiation without
Right,
representation.
but my basic
Yes.
question is does this area have to assume that until, if there is no interim storage, and I'm not at all saying that you're the place that it ought to go, but unless there is interim storage, we, and who knows how many of the other 75 or so ISTEs that are sitting around the country aren't going to be stuck with stuff that clearly shouldn't be there in high-density population areas, close to the water, long before, after everyone in this room and their children are dead.
Well, something I said in my talk, I'll try to be brief, is that there are places where hardened on-site storage is not appropriate. And one of the worst of those in the country is the Prairie Island Indian Reservation in the floodplain of the Mississippi River. And I also mentioned that, you know, Alliance for Nuclear Accountability and also an understanding of most of the groups involved with hardened on-site storage is that there are these exceptions, but when you look at the devilish details, you show me a nuclear power plant where it's appropriate. So as close as possible, as safely as
But as a
possible,
practical
hardened
matter,
storage.
what does
So
this
in-
area do to improve its
I
situation?
think, well, I think there are some things that can get worked on. I think it's really important to start working on your legislators at this point, in a way that hasn't, but where you really, where it's a grassroots movement. When we shut Vermont Yankee, they said they got more calls than they did on the gay marriage bill. They got thousands of phone calls. So that part of the work, I believe, because legislators hate to be exposed for being the idiots they are, excuse me, I didn't really say that, is that putting pressure on them can move them because they want to get reelected. And if they're feeling their job is at stake, and this is a campaign that needs to take place throughout Massachusetts, it's not just around Pilgrim. It has to happen in my neck of the woods in the West. It has to happen throughout the state, in which there is a campaign that calls every legislator again and again and says, this is not acceptable. We are stuck, and you have to, in fact, work to make this happen better than it is.
And specifically, what are we recommending that the Massachusetts legislators do?
We want some form of Haas.
My concluding thought about Prairie
Just
Island.
like the town of Vernon voted in favor of North Star because they want to stop the F out of there.
I understand, but the
Plymouth-
town of Vernon.
Plymouth selectmen are drooling for them to come to Plymouth to get the stuff, the F, out of here. So
But
we'll
this-
have taxable
Right.
lands.
But
I'm
the
just
land
saying,
will not be taxable.
And the
because-
governor,
Right.
who's appointed to the committees? More people from Plymouth, because it's how Plymouth feels that makes the difference politically.
In
So
Plymouth-
I'm
right.
just saying,
Right.
we're dealing with a reality. Not that I want you to be it,
Right.
but as a result, in my heart of hearts, I'm in favor of a two-track plan. Scientifically acceptable consent, truly consent-based, both interim and permanent, because recognizing permanent, if it's going to be a decent, because of the time frame, is going to take, my grandkids will be dead.
Yeah. Look, two things. One, the town of
And
Vernon
let me
will-
just say, the plan of finding a site, a nuclear waste reactor like Ed Lyman recommended, that's operating to accept the waste on a place like Pilgrim that is totally unsuited, it's a pipe dream. Ain't happening. And so I'm just trying to deal with some sort of realities. The perfect, let's not wreck the good. Let's try to work on getting the scientific bases, work on what the hell does consent-based mean?
One of the things you may look at, Arjun and I and Tim Judson and Diane Kern put a paper together on deep geological burial and bag. It might be worth taking a look at because it talks about what we feel needs to take place. When I started, Mary, I said there are only bad solutions. It's just all terrible where we are, and that's the first step. In terms of what Vernon said, Vernon will not decide what happens with North Star. It's the Public Service Board. The Public Service Board itself, the state has intervened in that hearing. The AG has intervened.
I've read them.
Yeah, they've all intervened, and they're really, it's on shaky ground, and they know it, so it's not clear. What that does, at least, is not set a precedent to do the worst kind of cleanup with basically scallywags calling the shots and doing an inept job. I mean, that is even worse. You have the high-level waste, and then you have a really contaminated site that no one is going to clean up because they've run out of money. So, I mean, it's just terrible. That's where we sit, in a terrible situation.
Okay.
I agree.
I had a concluding thought about Prairie Island, which is what I was leading to. And that is the clamor that was created at Prairie Island, including by the Prairie Island Indian community, at the very least, got an earthen wall built
Right.
around the dry casks,
Right.
which prevents line of sight attack with anti-tank missiles. And that same thing's been done at Palo Verde, Arizona. So
Right.
your point about zero hardening, there's been some hardening. It's in response to public clamor. About waste control specialists and these, these town councils embracing it. I mean, talk about clutching at straws. WCS is a major partner of North Star. They are on the edge of bankruptcy. Their only savior is if Energy Solutions of Utah
Yeah.
takes them over, and the Department of Justice right now is saying that ain't happening. So be careful where you hit your wagon.
Okay.
So who
I
paid
didn't
for
say I
Yeah.
hitched my
Yeah.
I
wagon.
didn't say you did.
Yeah, well,
I said,
who picked
I
up the
think
tab?
it's a good idea.
Who picked up the tab and got it going for
Utility
periodic-
did that. Utility did that.
The company?
As a part of their on-site storage costs.
That's the
The
difference.
utility.
That's why in states, we're looking at targeting states that are going to set up dry cask storage where their utilities, because the public service boards still have some power.
Yeah.
And in Vermont, part of why we believe we may have some effect is because North Star wants something. So it may also be in states where the corporation wants something that you gain some traction to try to get it to happen. But I think also to get it to happen, you have to do a lot of background work, which is getting legislators ahead of time to realize that what's happening is completely unacceptable.
And Deb, if I could add. We're also talking about and talking with people from Nebraska. The state of Nebraska is very unique in that private utilities are not legal. The entire state, by state law, is supplied by public power authorities. Because it's a public power state, politically, you have a whole lot more control. I mean, if you just look at how the city of Sacramento shut down its nuclear power plant by referendum in 1988, the public power aspect of what's going on in Nebraska lends itself to more public participation.
Yeah, but we're in Massachusetts.
I know, but we're talking about setting some precedents and trying to have places that we can point to that say, this is what we accomplished here. In Nebraska, Port Calhoun, as we call it, it's really Fort Calhoun, we call it, has been repeatedly flooded by the Missouri River. And for all we know tonight, with what's going on out there, it's being flooded. So it seems as it's a perfect candidate, not only for Haas, but to bring the waste some relatively short distance away from the riverbank, which is where it is, and put into a hardened storage situation.
And even Millstone, Dominion has done a better job than any other corporation in the Northeast in terms of the canisters they've set up, where they have accepted the fact that they're vulnerable to terrorism. And so they have in fact created a partial hardening, and they are lining them up on their sides in a whole different pattern.
Right.
And so they become an example in a state where there was not the ability to, have a utility, but where they have set some precedent that's worth bringing to Massachusetts to work on in that way, to cut a deal with Entergy that's going to want to get out from under in the state of Massachusetts as well. Well, to get out from under, one of the things the state of Massachusetts could negotiate is make casks like Millstone has. They took it on, why don't you? This is part of the work. Will it work? I can't guarantee it, but it's worth a try in it. Except,
We couldn't
Baker
even
is so
get-
weak.
We couldn't even get the Plymouth the permit. Energy just decided to put the damn thing where they wanted it.
Right.
We've been trying to get them to move it back away from the bay and can't do that.
I understand.
Yeah, it almost seems like Rose doesn't have to worry at all.
Rose?
This isn't gonna happen, all the units.
Rose?
The temporary.
Rose.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, Rose.
Yeah.
Eunice.
It's
I
like-
was gonna tell you why Rose doesn't matter, because it's got a giant reservoir behind it that almost broke in the last hurricane, in which my 16 casts would have wound up in Shelburne Falls, under 20 feet of water. So, I mean, these are not easy solutions anyway.
Anybody else?
We've driven you crazy. I want to apologize, because after we give these talks, everyone wants to drink. Me included.
Here's one.
I have a general question about the solution called HOS, I guess is what you guys call it, for storage. Specifically, could you go into how other countries that have nuclear waste are dealing with it? And is HOS their recommended?
Glad you asked
Yeah,
that. Thinking
that's
that, you know,
really good.
we're Americans, we're not supposed to look elsewhere for good ideas, right?
That's
So,
really good.
Germany's been hardening essentially for decades. They were worried about domestic terrorism, they were worried about being on the front line of the Cold War. And so they hardened their interim storage at Gorleben in a building to prevent, bombing, to prevent anti-tank missiles. To some extent, it could be improved. The Germans would be the first to tell you it's not an ideal situation. Switzerland has moved that direction. Canada is moving that direction. They haven't done it up till now, but they're beginning to require it up there. So, yet again, American exceptionalism, we are the outlier. I mean, we are wide open to terrorist attack, to natural disasters with the dry cask storage. Of course, the pools are the most vulnerable. So I actually forgot to mention, we have the principles for safeguarding nuclear waste at nuclear power plants on the back table. So it gives the HOS principles and the signatories across the country.
And it seems like the new ones are going bankrupt, right? They can't make new power plants?
You got it.
Current Westinghouse?
Westinghouse Nuclear and Toshiba's very wobbly.
It's just not feasible anymore, right?
Yep.
Okay, we've got lineup
Can I
now.
just follow up?
Okay, you follow up, and then you next, and then over here.
Are they also pursuing long-term storage sites?
Yeah.
Or are they focused on the solution where they are, and we're gonna harden them there?
The German story is pretty remarkable. Beginning in 1978, a site was targeted for disposal at Gorleben. And so this interim storage was right on the edge of this salt formation. And there were decades, up until the present, of mass demonstrations because people didn't accept it. It was, again, a political solution. It was as far from Bonn, West Germany, as you could get in West Germany. Put it right on the border with East Germany, and then guess what? The two Germanys reunited, and now it's in the middle of the country, near Berlin, right? So there were mass protests right up to the present. And then it comes out just several years ago that the Conservative Party knew that this site was flawed, and they kept it quiet. And that came out several years ago. So it's a flawed site geologically. Not unlike, the waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico is really why this area is being targeted for a nuclear sacrifice zone. And how did that come to be? A used car salesman became mayor of Carlsbad, New Mexico, read an article in the newspaper that salt's the best place to dump nuclear waste and there's money to be made. And that is where WIP came from. And we saw what that led to in February of 2014 when they had the impossible leak from this dump into the environment.
From
So
Kitty
these are-
Lou.
Okay,
These
got
are
one
flawed
here,
sites.
and then
Recently, our legislators, state legislators, were in the process of writing a letter to the new president asking that Yucca Mountain be open to receive nuclear waste. My question is, not long ago, maybe it was longer ago than I remember, but they had the hearings for the supplemental environmental impact report. Does Congress ever get the results of that and what the feedback has been from the public?
Not really. On my first day in DC, I met Richard Bryan, who was the senator from Nevada. He was governor before that, and he still leads the commission in the state of Nevada fighting Yucca Mountain. At the